Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be walking through activity 6-7 titled Creating a File Server Failover Cluster. This is from the MCSE/MCSA Guide to Configuring Advanced Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2 Services in preparation of exam 70-412. In my edition of the book, this activity begins. So this is the second part in a series for failover clusters for high availability services. In my first video, we installed the roles and created the cluster, but we haven't configured any roles or any services for it to provide yet. So that's what this video is going to be about. If you need to set up and validate, and then configure and create your cluster, you'll need to go watch the first video and then come back here for the actual configuration portion. So to continue, we still have our three servers. Server 1 is our domain controller. Server 2 is a non-domain controller. It is the first node in the failover. And then server 3 is the second node in the failover. Again, it is not a domain controller, it's just a member server of the domain. Same thing with server 2, just a member server. So if you're following in the book, on server 3, you'll want to go ahead and add the file server role. You can do that from your server manager, go add role, make sure you select server 3. Since these are in a cluster now, it'll probably show you both servers. You want to make sure that you select server 3, and then it's underneath your roles, file and storage services, file and iSCSI services, and then file server is the first one under there. So get that installed. It does not require a reboot, so if you want to follow along and you're doing this, go ahead and get that done right now. Pause the video, get that installed, and then come back and we'll continue. Another thing I'm going to mention here before we install the role is that you can actually manage the cluster from any server that's part of the cluster. So both server 2 and server 3 can manage the cluster. This can cause some problems, especially if you have multiple administrators that are working on these clusters, because if you're working through one server and another administrator is working through the other server, then your guys' configurations can actually clash and cause some problems. So I would recommend that, especially if you guys are doing the same thing and kind of configuring the same roles, whatever the case may be, just get in the habit of always using one specific node, one specific server in the cluster to manage and configure. That way you don't have that problem where both of you are trying to do the same thing and you're causing problems for each other. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and use server 2 as my configuration node because it's the first node in the cluster. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to configure the role. Before we begin, we want to make sure that our storage is online, so select storage and disks. You want to make sure that your witness is online and that your available storage is online. If your available storage is offline, go ahead and bring it online, right-click, bring it online. And then we'll configure the role, and we're going to, this will explain kind of what we're doing, so we'll skip forward. We want to select the file server role. We have two options here. I'm going to start down here. The scale out file server for application data. This is for any data that is going to be open to clients over long periods of time. For example, especially for virtual machines, if you're storing virtual machine data on this file service, anytime that virtual machine is powered on, it is accessing its VM data from this service. So that's going to be open as long as the virtual machine is on. On the flip side, you have the file server for general use, which is what we're going to set up right now. And this is just for like documents and data that users will access. They'll use it for whatever their short period of time is, and then they close the file or whatever the case may be for what they have open. So the data is being repeatedly accessed, but it's not open and in use for long periods of time. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Again, it's for like documents and pictures, stuff like that. So we'll hit next. You want to go ahead and give this a name. This is how it's going to register itself in DNS, so it can be found by name on your network. If you're following in the book, it says to use the name Failover 1 FS for file server or file service. Keep in mind that your users can access this by name, so if that's how you're implementing it, you might want to make your name something that makes a little bit more sense to your users, because they're not going to care that it's a failover or a cluster. They just want to know that they have access to it. So one thing that I usually recommend is to set like a domain name and make it a domain share to your users, or make it look like a server to your users. So for my example right now, this test domain is the 412 dom1, and then I would just tag on there -fs. If you want to make it look more like a server, then you can do that as well. You can name it whatever you want here. I just recommend making it something that your users will understand and they'll know how to access it. This could be your company name, whatever the case may be for your particular environment. It does need a reserved address, so you want to make sure this is an address that's not going to be used by anything else, and it's not currently in use. So for the book, we're going to go ahead and use 151 for this network, the 10.12.1.151. 150 is the cluster itself, so we'll use 151 for the FS. Since I only have the one storage space available in addition to the witness, that's the only option for me. If you have yours set up for multiple storage volumes, select the one that you've configured or that you've prepped for your FS and continue. That last step is why it needs to be online. If it's offline and you only have one, then you'll have nothing here and you'll have to cancel this whole thing, go bring it online, and then come back. So moving on. This is a review. So we're using this storage, which we configured in the last video. This is going to be my network name that I can access these shares through on the network. That's going to be the registered IP address for the service. So we'll go ahead and let it get started configuring. If you see any errors, if it throws any errors for you, you might want to troubleshoot those and correct them. Mine didn't throw any errors, so I can't go over any specific problems that you might run into. You can always view the report, and it should be fairly detailed. And so it goes through step by step everything that it did. I'm just going to go ahead and finish. And then when we select roles, we see that 412 server FS. Again, this could be company name -FS. We see the owner node is 412 server 2, which is, in this case, the first node that I added to the cluster, and also the node that I configured the role with. So we're going to hop back over to my domain controller. I want to take a look at a couple of things really quickly. The first is DNS. So it's right here, so it registered itself in DNS. I didn't create that, it was created automatically. If you remove the role, it should also remove itself from DNS dynamically, so you don't have to worry too much about that. You can also look in Active Directory, and so it also created an Active Directory computer account for itself for that role that the cluster is hosting. And the last thing I want to check is DHCP. Since we did that manually, I'm honestly not certain if it is going to show here. So it looks like it did not do anything in DHCP, so if you configure that, you'll likely want to come in and create a reservation for that IP address so that your DHCP server doesn't give that address to another machine. Or just make sure that when you configure that, you're using an address that you have an exclusion range for. So for example, for this, I could have used anything below 100 that's not already in use, because my DHCP server is going to start at 100 and go up. So I could have put my FS service at 1.99, and I would have been fine. Since I didn't, I'll want to go ahead and make a reservation. for 151 for that service, and I could even go ahead and just name it here the same thing. It will be expecting a MAC address. I think you can actually just put in all zeros. And just say that's a clustered FS dedicated address. So since that service is not receiving the IP address from DHCP, this will just make sure that DHCP does not assign the address, so it doesn't really matter what the MAC address shows in DHCP. And that just verifies that it will not hand that address out. Alright, so we have the role running. Both of my nodes are up, so I'm going to go ahead and test that share. I haven't created anything in it yet, so we'll also do that, and we'll test the actual failover portion here. So our users, anybody on the domain, can access it directly by either IP address, which if you have multiple servers and a lot of different services available on your network, your users probably aren't going to have all of the IP addresses memorized. Really not a big deal, because they can also do it by name because of that and accessed it the same way. So I want to go back and take a quick look at the shares that it's hosting. Now that I know I have access to it, I currently have no shares available, except for the default administrator share. So I want to go ahead and I'm going to create a new share. And once this comes up, I'm just going to go ahead and call it documents, so that's to make sure that it can communicate with both nodes. And so we have multiple different options here. Your SMB shares are going to be mostly for Windows machines. Your NFS will be for Unix and some Linux machines. It depends on your network and your environment, again, how you want to set this up. If you use the SMB quick, it's just very basic, very default settings for everything. You can do the advanced, where you can configure quotas, classifications, folder owners, as it mentions here. So it's not just for access denied assistance, it's also to control who has access to what. But it does include access denied assistance. For this little test environment, I'm just going to do a quick one. And again, if you have multiple volumes for this service, it depends on how you have yours configured and how much space you have available. We want to give it a share name, so I'm just going to call it documents. We put a description in there. I'm going to go ahead and skip it. And here is how your clients are going, or your users will be able to access the share. So if you use group policy, you can push this out as a shortcut onto their desktop, or create drive mapping directly to this share. However you want to manage that. Access-based enumeration will hide anything that a user doesn't have access to. So they'll only see the files and folders that they have permission to access. If they don't have read or higher permissions, then they just don't see that directory or that file. Continuous availability, it works with the whole reason we're doing this, the high availability with the cluster. So this allows it to migrate live from one node in the cluster to the other node as needed. So if I'm accessing it and it's accessed through server 2 right now, and server 2 for whatever reason goes offline, then my client will automatically start accessing it through server 3 through the other node in the cluster without the user being aware that it's happening at all. So there will be no interruption unless all of my nodes go down, which would be very, very bad. Caching allows contents to be available to offline users. This is particularly useful for the branch cache if you're using it. You can customize your basic permissions. So for this, I went ahead earlier and I added in my domain administrator account to make sure that he has access to create, modify, delete as needed. So if you're using a domain, you might want to make sure you add your domain admin in there. If you have specific users, you can add the user accounts individually, or if you have user group accounts with those users in it, you can just add the one group. It makes it pretty straightforward like that. This is going to be verification that we're setting all this up in this particular manner. I'm going to go ahead and tell it to create. And it's done already, so we'll close that. And then we're going to come back and access it again here. And now I see that document share on my domain controller. Since he's not part of the cluster, this shows that I can access it from outside the cluster. I even have a default document that I created earlier. And so my administrator should be able to add content. Since he has full rights, I should be able to save this, close it. I can create completely new data. I can remove data. So my administrator has full control. So I know that works correctly. You may also want to test with the user if you give a user permissions for this. Just make sure that they're getting the correct permissions, especially if this is sensitive data that's going to be on this share. Make sure that a user that shouldn't be able to access it can't access it. Just verify your security. So I see back here in my cluster manager that server 2 is the owner, so he's kind of the active host. I want to see what happens if I take him offline, because it should automatically fail over to my second node, and so my users should have no interruption, or if there's any interruption at all, it should be very, very brief, 10 to 15 seconds, and up and running again, almost instantly. So to simulate this server crashing on me, I'm just going to disable its network interface. Am I taking that offline? Either it happened so quickly I didn't see it, or it may not have happened at all. So let's take a look back here. Since the server is not connected, I can't be sure that that's up to date, so we'll access it through my active node. And here I should recognize, yep, so 1 is down, which is my server 2. That node should be on its network connection. Alright, so we can see that that server is offline right now. Clustering on my domain controller. On that share without. And then whenever server 2 comes back online, back possession, I think since server 3 is now the owner, he's going to hold it until I manually transfer it back. can get back into my network connections here. Go ahead and get the node back online, and it should not take long at all once it's back online for it to start sending those establish the failover. Once that comes back up, go ahead and refresh here. Alright, so that heartbeat hasn't come through yet. Probably just my system being a little bit slow. That heartbeat's coming through, it's rejoining the cluster. And as soon as that's done, we will make it the owner again of that role. So there we go. Once it's online, it'll automatically rejoin and establish that heartbeat for communication. And now server 3 has retained ownership, but we can come in here and move, select node, the best possible node. I haven't used it. In theory, it should provide the most reliable and the quickest access. I've only got 2 nodes, so I'm just going to manually put it back to server 2. It'll take a few seconds. This has to notify server 2 that it's going to be the owner again, and then hand over that ownership, and then server 2 is now the owner again. So that way if server 3 goes offline, nothing has to change at all. Server 2 will realize it's not receiving the heartbeat from server 3, and it'll just continue providing the service as normal. I think that's pretty much everything that the book wanted covered, plus probably a little bit extra. So, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them for me below. I will try to reply in a timely fashion. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.